the wild. Dispatch. Hello and welcome to the Wild Dispatch. I'm Robin and I'm back with more skills and stories from the wild. Now, I'm excited to say that this is episode 20, which is, I'm aware, very obvious because it's written in the title, but it's a big deal for me. It's been, I'm not entirely sure. How long has it been? Coming up to 5 months now that I've been off on this adventure. Let's call it an adventure. I've had an amazing time. I've spoken to loads of amazing people all over the world. And yeah, I've heard fantastic stories, incredible skills. It feels like now is a good moment to take pause and just appreciate all the people who've been involved and everyone who's listened as well, everyone who's come along on this journey. So thank you, everyone. It's been amazing. With that in mind, if you are enjoying this whole, what do we call this? Podcast. If you're enjoying this whole podcast, then a like or a subscribe would be fantastic. If you're feeling incredibly generous, then a 5-star review would be above and beyond. Apparently, all those kinds of things help with the algorithms and help with how the show pops up on all the different places that people get their podcasts. So any of those things above would be greatly appreciated. So as I said before, I've had some fantastic guests over the past 5-ish months, and this one is no exception. Today's guest is Justin Williams. He hails from South Africa. He is an avid, some would say a rabid mushroom hunter, but he is also a mushroom guide as well. So he does it professionally. He is also soon to be published. He is the author of his first book about mushroom hunting in South Africa. There will be more information in the future about when that is coming out, but there is also an ebook version, which is an earlier version available, which you can check at the end of this episode. Or if you can't wait for that and you want to cheat, then you can go down into the show notes and there'll be some info about it there. So thank you again, Justin, for your skills and stories today. Thank you all for listening, and I'll stop waffling and let's get on with the show. His brains first. First, I'll say hello. Welcome, Justin.
Hey, Robin. Thanks for having me today. It's so good to see you again. And I'm looking so forward to diving deep today into the world of mushrooms and other mysterious things together.
Amazing. So I've got to ask, because I did see a couple of things on Instagram. I do cruise there occasionally. Has the mushroom season started over there yet? Please tell me it has.
It has, technically, yes. Here in Cape Town, our mushroom season starts typically in about mid-January when it's midsummer. And it begins with chicken of the woods, or Latiporus sulphureus. It begins growing from oak trees in summer, and that usually is our very first mushroom of the year to begin picking, and the start of the season mushroom.
Okay, interesting. It's a little different to how things work over in California or Northern California, but we'll get all to that specific detail later. But at first, we should do a bit of an intro. If you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, that would be amazing.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Justin, born and raised in Cape Town. I have loved nature my whole life. Have been obsessed about mushrooms, I guess, for the last about 12 years. And really, I've just kind of grown up with an outlook, thanks to my parents, about just being curious when going into nature, being grateful for growing up around some truly amazing places here around the city, and really just wanting to know more and more about mushrooms. I feel like my journey is still far from over. And although some people will consider me as someone who's learned in the field, I feel like my journey is just starting, which I guess being humble kind of keeps you grounded and opens you up to more knowledge to come your way. So that's really kind of my mantra when it comes to foraging mushrooms, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And you are being very humble. I've got to say, I've got a few little notes down here. So from my research that I did before this and our conversations as well, you're a mushroom guide and also like pretty active and helpful in the mushroom community, as far as I understand it. Which is actually how I got connected to you on Facebook. There is a group, I believe it's called Mushrooms of the Western Cape. Is that the correct group?
Mhm. That's right.
So,
Yes.
so you're on there, and also, I believe you're also writing a book about mushrooms at the moment. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. So guiding, yes, guiding is a new thing I started doing as a full-time gig. Previously, I've spent 15 years working in corporate and foraging as a after-hours activity. But it was only 3 months ago where I decided to actually leave the corporate world behind me and get into guiding full-time. But I have been teaching foraging for the past 8 years. But I've loved it so much that now I just cannot ignore it any longer, and I'm doing it full-time now, and it's been going great.
Amazing. That's so good as well. I love to hear stories like that where people will make that brave jump into the thing that they're really passionate about. And I think it's pretty scary to do that, right? Because at least for me
Yeah.
personally, there's an element of like your hobby is your like your sacred escape in some ways. So then jumping into that and making it your everything is always a little bit of a teetering, stepping on the cliff. Like, is this a good choice? But
100% right.
it
Yeah.
sounds like it's going good so far.
It's going great. I think turning a passion into a full-time gig requires a level of like kind of dampening down your excitement for it, because once you're doing this every single day, I guess the novelty wears off, but it's a case of really staying on track and reminding myself why I'm so passionate about mushrooms. And even though now I've got bills to pay, um, from the mushrooms themselves and teaching people where to find them, I have to stay kind of focused and remember that I love these things. And now, just because they're helping dictate my income, I have to not look at it any differently. I have to treat it exactly the same and still kind of share that passion and give off that vibe that I love what I'm doing, even though they've got to help me pay my bills.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's good though. It's good to have that perspective. There
Good
is a
man.
question though I have based on what you were saying, and
Yeah.
maybe it's loosely connected. But I recently was lucky enough to go picking with actually a friend of the pod,
Mhm.
Billy. There's a couple of episodes that he's done about mushrooms too, and it was really fun. I've never been picking with like a commercial objective beforehand. We went looking for black trumpets and also happened to find some other mushrooms,
Ooh.
which I was very happy about. but but yeah, we got I think like 30 pounds, so that's what about 13, 14 kilos
Yeah.
of black trumpets, and
Damn.
I learned an absolute ton. So thanks to Billy for that. But also there was just like a feverish like extra fun, like an intensity in the searching, because there's an element of normally if you're looking for mushrooms you find them, you're like, yay, now I'm going to put these in my backpack. The hunt's
Yeah.
maybe it's done or maybe it's not done, but you're already like, yes, brilliant. But when there's like, okay, we have this objective, we need to keep going, we've like filled our backpacks, we've filled shopping bags, we need to go back to the truck and we're coming back.
Yeah.
I kind of really enjoyed that like level of intensity. Maybe that just says something more about me than than anything else.
I think there's some kind of level of euphoria and maybe minor delirium that sets in when you've picked so much of like this incredible choice edible mushroom. You know it's going to be absolutely delicious when you've got like what you said, 13, 14 kilos of it, and knowing when to stop. Like, up until that moment, you're kind of dizzy, you're drunk with like this feeling of euphoria because you've just been exposed to these magical kind of organisms. And there's a certain kind of thrill and rush, as you would know, that you get from collecting these delicacies. And it just leaves you feeling sensationally good. When you are exposed to such a good honey hole of such a good species, it's like it blows you away completely.
Yeah, it's weird. I think you're completely right. I wonder, this is absolute speculation on my part, but I wonder if it's tapping into some primeval evolutionary thing of it's in some ways it's kind of the original wealth where when you land a good like nutritional resource, there's this,
Yeah.
I don't know, there's this sense of excitement but also calm. You're like everything's going to be good for a while
Yeah, I
because
would
got
agree
all
with
this
you,
food.
Yeah, there's like this like primal thing inside of you that says famine what's that? We've got our food here. Like, we're going to be surviving just fine for the next like couple of weeks. So
Yeah.
I would certainly agree with you. I think there's something primal that fires within our minds when finding such a good haul.
Okay. I'm glad you agree. So there's also one other thing on my little listy here of things to mention, which is it's interesting. I'd love to pick your brains about this perhaps later on, once we've delved deep into the mycelium underground
Yeah.
and that whole side of things. But you also got another project going on about scent and natural scent. I believe it's called
Yes.
Follow Your Nose. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yes. Yeah, Follow Your Nose is a business I've recently started to coincide with full-time guiding and foraging. And I've always had a keen sense of smell. And you know, after a number of years of spending time in forests and the places where I collect mushrooms, I started getting curious about the scents that I was exposed to in these habitats, like the smell of a damp forest floor in the morning, or the smell of wildflowers. I began to grow curious about how to actually bottle these scents. And that put me into a deep dive into understanding perfumery, how it's made, what goes into your bottle. And that's where I've been kind of focusing a lot of my energies for the past few years is developing fragrances that are inspired by wild places around Cape Town and Greater South Africa.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's such a true thing that scent is kind of like the undervalued scent or the undervalued sense that we seem to have. Like often, weirdly, when you're trudging around the woods, even looking for mushrooms or animals as well, sometimes I have to say that I've smelled them quite a way before. It's like something goes in your brain where you smell and you're like, okay, I need to get ready. I need to focus right now because I'm in the zone now. Does that make sense?
Spot on. Yeah, there is certainly a lot of chemistry at play, with all these aroma molecules around us. And when they actually hit our kind of nasal cavities, certain signals get fired to different parts of our brain, two predominantly, one responsible for memory, another one responsible for emotion, which is why scent is so powerful and it can really bring us back to a different place and time in our memories. Because I think smell is it's so overlooked rather. And far more overlooked than like the sense of taste or sight. There's something way more powerful when smelling a scent that just takes you back to a different place. And when you're walking in the forest, smelling a porcini from like 20 meters away, you know that distinct scent, like it's there, you get excited, it triggers some kind of messaging to your brain, and all you got to do is find it, which just makes you completely overwhelmed with joy. When you follow your nose literally to the prize, it's just such an incredible feeling.
It's so true. It's so
Yeah.
true. Okay, so if you don't mind, what I usually like to do, I'd love to go into a bit of your story. Yeah, I'd love to hear how you grew up, where you grew up, and how you sort of started building that connection with wild places that you clearly have.
I grew up a very typical 2.4 family, white picket fence, middle class suburbia kind of vibe. That was my upbringing. I grew up in a suburb of Cape Town called Noordhoek, which is considered to be in the deep south, quote unquote, of Cape Town. And I say deep south, it's only geographically, not anything other, no other reason for it being called the deep south.
Yeah, yeah.
It's near Cape, it's not too far from Cape Point. And yeah, it's kind of got a geographical kind of allure to it because the actual town is situated between the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean with a strip of land in between. And it's actually a natural peninsula, the Cape Peninsula. And, so this basically means I had access to two different oceans, a wealth of different kind of biodiverse ecosystems. And here we refer to our vegetation as fynbos. And there are several dozen different habitats of fynbos across the Western Cape, and a lot of them are found here on the Cape Peninsula. So growing up, it was always different flowers, different hiking trails, different forested environments that I was exploring in with my parents, mostly my dad, and also just spending a lot of time in the sea. So that was my upbringing. I was very lucky for my dad to kind of introduce me to foraging very early on. He would take me down to the rocks, we'd collect mussels. My mom would prepare like a mussel soup with home baked beer bread.
Oh,
So I was
wow.
always I used to have like a very strong connection with foraging from an early age. there used to be feral lemon trees in our neighborhood. We'd go there and just pick them like it was anything. And I couldn't really understand like why this food was free. Like surely we had to pay for it, but that wasn't the case. So foraging has been a big part of my life since like a youngster, maybe about 6 years old. And I grew up kind of really nurturing that thanks to my parents. But I think mushrooms entered my life for the first time when I was 10 years old.
Okay.
And this was in the 90s. And what happened was that, me and my family didn't know anything about mushrooms at the time. In South Africa, our varieties, I'm sure, were less than a lot of other kind of markets overseas. We had white button mushrooms and portobello mushrooms, and that was it. There was no other mushrooms around. But one of my dad's friends came over for dinner one night and told us that every mushroom you see growing in pine forests is edible. And we were like, really? Is that so? Because we'd seen many different types of mushrooms growing, walking our dogs in the local pine plantations here. We were like, wow, okay, well, let's go check it out. So the next week, my dad and I went to the one pine plantation we knew had lots of mushrooms growing in. And we went into the forest and we started looking for these mushrooms. And after a while, they started appearing to us. We found the red one with the white dots on it. I thought that looked really cool. I couldn't wait to see what that one tasted like. And then we found purplish colored ones that were like white underneath. And then we found a bunch of orange ones that were growing from an old pine stump, very big orange colored ones. And we were like, wow, okay, into our shopping bag they all went. And we took them home. And we started preparing them in the kitchen. We started getting the pan out and completely expecting to be tasting these mushrooms in a few minutes. Now, thank goodness my mom came into the room and brought an old library field guide she'd taken out early that week, a British field guide from the library. And she said, let's just check to see if we can find any in the book to see what we've collected. So we're like, okay, cool, well, let's do that. So we started flipping through the pages of this old British field guide, and there was the red one with the white dots, Amanita muscaria, the fly agaric, skull and crossbones next to it. We were like, what? Okay, that's not good. Flipped over the pages some more. Russula. Okay, Russula is the same one we've got. Inedible, suspect. We're like, okay, there are actually quite a different number of Russulas. Some you can eat, some you can't eat, some are inedible. So that was that. My mom took the mushrooms, chucked them into the bin. No more picking mushrooms. This could have been very dangerous. So that was that. That was like my first foray. It really kind of, I think, started piquing my curiosity over time. Like, what can you eat? We know what you can't eat, but what can you collect? So we were very curious.
I've got a
And my
question.
father, yeah, go for
Sorry
it.
to interrupt, though. What I'm imagining you're young, so you probably didn't have any side of this story, but I'm wondering if you were involved in any way, or if your dad had a word with his like helpful neighbor who was just like, yeah, knock yourself out. Like,
Yeah. There's definitely, I think that we have that word, we have that concept in Afrikaans, the language spoken here.
yeah.
But I can't actually remember how we followed up to my dad's friend, because he was a
Okay.
really good friend of ours and he was miraculously still alive after dispensing such bad advice. But he's no longer around now. He did pass on a few years ago, not from
Okay.
mushrooms, I might add. But
Okay.
yeah, it could have been a bad experience, but ultimately we emerged unscathed, and it just really helped me on my own mushroom journey.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so from that moment, mushrooms went in the bin, but you had this experience, this kind of interaction with mushrooms, and it piqued your interest. It was quite a while, was it, before you next dabbled in mushrooms, or what was the kind of next moment that they came back into your circle, so to speak?
I must say, when I was 16 years old, I discovered magic mushrooms. Dun dun dun. Psilocybes. I was the town that I grew up in, Notuk. It is considered to be a dry town, which means that when the actual town was developed in the 1800s, the farmers granted the land to be developed on the proviso that no alcohol would ever be sold in this area. So for that
Oh,
reason, and up until this day, it's considered to be a dry town where no alcohol sold. So the youth had to find other ways and means of, how can I say, expanding their consciousness without alcohol, like teenagers generally do. So for that reason, cannabis and magic mushrooms were more readily available, I'd say, in our area. And as a very curious 16-year-old, I remember taking it with my friends for the first time. Sorry, mom and dad, if you're listening, it's okay. I can admit it to you now, but I did try mushrooms when I was 16 years old. It was great. I remember we tried it at my friend's parents' house. His parents had gone away for the weekend on holiday, and we had the entire house to ourselves. It was me, three of my best mates. We had 2 grams each, which is quite, I would consider, a fairly large dose for 16-year-olds. But it was sensationally good, and I remember seeing curtains moving in and out like they were breathing, having just the absolute most vivid, sensational experience. And I think that was an awakening for me at that very point in time, 2003, age 16, wondering, wow, mushrooms are actually quite interesting if they can make me feel this way. So I think it was only a few years later where I started becoming obsessed with hunting for them, or rather foraging for them in natural habitats around here. It was in about 2010 when I started Googling mushrooms that grow in my lawn, and how do I know which one is which? Because the internet was a lot more established by then, whereas it wasn't back in the days when I was still in school. And I think having an early interest in the edible mushrooms, because I was very curious about food and the culinary arts at that point in my life, I began to grow more interested in them. And it's been, yeah, about 14 years now where I've just kind of have been exponentially more and more interested in them over time.
Can you remember like a specific moment? Like you said that you were seeing them around or whatever, or was you even your lawn, but like was there a moment that can you remember the first mushroom that you were like brave enough to try after this mildly traumatic experience in the past of almost poisoning yourself thanks to your mum saving you? But was there, can you remember what it was as the first thing that you picked? And then we're like, okay, I'm going to
Yes.
try this.
Yes, it was the shaggy mane, or Coprinus comatus. It
Okay.
did used to grow on the lawn of the house I grew up in, and I moved out when I was much older, but my parents still lived there. And it was the same year where I started actually researching a bit more, where I knew that this mushroom growing from the lawn of my parents' garden was definitely an edible species. And everyone thinks it looks poisonous, including myself. I tried it with a lot of hesitation at first. I fried it up in a pan. I added a lot of garlic, which in hindsight wasn't a good way to prepare it because garlic's very overpowering. But I tried this mushroom. I offered it to my mom and my dad and my sister, and they all flat out refused. And they thought I was crazy for trying this thing that grew on the lawn. Like they thought I was so mad, and they were getting ready to phone the hospital afterwards. I think they were just very paranoid about my well-being. But it was good. It tasted interesting, unlike anything I'd ever tried before. And it's considered to be one of the foolproof four mushrooms. I know that now, that this is one of the foolproof four, that you can't really mistake it for anything else. It's entirely safe to eat and pretty delicious if you know how to prepare it the right way.
Okay, sweet. Well, that's a good. That is catchy as well. The foolproof four. Okay, and
Yeah.
I'm going to pick your brains about that later on. So
Okay.
hopefully I remember. I'm just going to make a note.
Good.
Um, okay, sweet. So I'm guessing that that moment was effectively when your kind of mycological snowball started rolling. Did you at that point then get jumping into the mushroom community on Facebook and everything? You're saying the internet was more developed at that point. Was that kind of a moment, or was there did you have any mentors, or was there anyone helping you along?
So it's been amazing to see the local mushroom community blossom. I dare say mushroom over time, because that'll be just a bad pun. I could say that for the blooper reel. But yeah, I mean, Facebook came about in here in South Africa. Everybody only really started joining it in 2007. Groups came a bit later. And I think from about 2013, mushroom groups started becoming established here in South Africa. Mushrooms of Southern Africa is the big group. And
Okay, okay.
the wonderful thing about this group was that it actually saw people who had previously been studying on their own accord, um, like unseen people, unseen experts around the country, who actually had a bit of a platform for the very first time to start sharing their mushroom finds from where they were around the country. And we had a larger concentration of mushroom people here in Cape Town, as opposed to Joburg, Durban, East London, Bloemfontein. But there have been emerging as of late these smaller micro communities from those other cities. But Cape Town has been, I think, the city where the most mushroom, I guess, interest has been growing over the past decade. And I really attribute it to Facebook, Instagram a bit later. Um, yeah, I think early last decade is where it all started, thanks to tools like Facebook. It's been wonderful to just share knowledge and see what everyone else is getting at different times of the year. And I've played a part in that myself to some extent, sharing my finds, seeing other people's finds, exchanging notes with other really knowledgeable people, of which there are some incredibly knowledgeable people around the country. Some of them don't even use Facebook, so I've had to meet them in person at mushroom events and other kinds of holidaying experiences. I've met young people who are dropping the most crazy Latin names to me of mushrooms, and I was like, wow! And they've been teaching me things, and I've never heard of these people. They don't interact on any forum. They're just kind of like silent experts, and there's a lot of them around, and I really respect them.
That's so interesting. I mean, it's funny because I was going to say the same thing about my conversation with you, that you have a clearly a good handle of scientific language, terms of the mushrooms, but also you seem to have like a good contextual understanding from a scientific background. So I'm curious, did you have like a scientific background in your past, or did you work in the sciences in some way? Because you seem very
No,
comfortable.
thank you so much, Robin. Like I really appreciate that because I'm a complete dunce when it comes to academia. Um, Definitely, I've learned later on in life about myself that I'm kind of borderline ADHD, which I actually attribute now as a superpower when it comes to foraging because I have a very quick attention span that actually really helps me when foraging in a natural kind of setting. But coming back to your question, I graduated, finished matric with subpar grades. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, but I was always good at TV games and computer games. I actually really always liked electronics.
Hmm.
And the friends of mine at the time said to me the year after school, they were like, why don't you study computer science? So I thought, okay, I could do computer science.
Yeah.
So I studied, long story short, I studied computer science for 3 years. And after graduating, I realized that I'm just too creative to be working with code and being a programmer. Like, that's not for me. So I spent the next 15 years, I guess, looking back at my career now, migrating into a marketing role, using PR and communication, social media, offering these skills as a professional. And that was really my professional journey, is more corporate and not so sciencey whatsoever. Everything that I kind of know about science and mycology has been self-taught. There haven't been any mentors along the way. There's only been one that I'll talk about now. It's actually somebody I've never met before. It's a very, very interesting story. It's quite a cool Cape Town story.
Okay.
So there was an author who was around about 100 years ago. He was a historian and author based here in Cape Town. His name was Lawrence Green. And he wrote about what my great grandfather, who was a very famous horse whisperer up in Namibia. And my mom had this book because it was her grandfather, my great grandfather, who was of German descent. And I read about my great grandfather in this book, his swashbuckling tales of like going through the Kalahari Desert and these kind of like old school kind of this old school narrative of descriptions of the native peoples and so on and so forth. So it's a little bit politically incorrect to kind of view it as it was intended back then today. But anyway, he also this author also wrote about a character named Joseph Masurek, who was a master herbalist and forager who lived on Table Mountain for 40 years. And I was like, wow, how does somebody live on Table Mountain as a hermit for 40 years? And I started doing more and more research about this character. And he had the most insane life story. So this guy, Joseph Masaryk, was born in the late 1800s.
Wow.
He was an orphan and he grew up in a Trappist monastery in Eastern Europe. And he studied medicine in Romania in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it was said that he found a cure for cholera, but because he hadn't yet graduated, he was scorned by his medical fraternity at the university. And so he decided to abandon his studies. And he spent the next 20 years walking around Europe, learning the way of the herbalist on foot. He just like completely abandoned any responsibilities he had in life and completely took to the road as a hermit, learning herbalism along the way. And before the outbreak of the First World War, he went onto a ship destined for the East, but came around Africa, landed in Cape Town, got off the ship, liked everything he saw, went further up, got back onto the ship, went to East London as the next port, and decided to abandon the ship and walk back to Cape Town.
Wow.
Now, it takes I mean, in being in South Africa, you know that Cape Town to East London is a very far distance to even drive. It takes about 16 hours just to drive it.
Yeah,
He spent a year walking, a whole 365 a year walking back from East London to Cape Town, where he made his home for the next 40 years, living on Table Mountain, learning our local plants, learning the mushrooms. And a lot of his life's work was captured by this author who I referenced earlier. So I would attribute Joe Masaryk and his writings to be, I guess, my strongest kind of force for education, and has really shaped my own journey. And he
that's
passed away as a he buried as a pauper at a local cemetery here. I go visit his grave every so often, but there's no tombstone. I just kind of think about him and spare a thought for his life. But I attribute him, I would say, as my greatest teacher in mushrooms and foraging and so on.
that's amazing. That's such a great story. Thanks for sharing that.
Of
I'm
course.
so
Cool.
like a bit of context. Table Mountain. I mean, I think, I mean, it's like one of the seven wonders of the world, maybe. I don't know if
Yes, it
that's true,
is. I
but
think last time I checked, yeah.
I
I
don't think it's been
think.
bumped off the spot off the
No.
list yet. But it's an amazing mountain, about 3 or 4 thousand feet, like 1,000-ish meters high, maybe a little bit
That's right.
higher,
Yeah.
and it's this incredible flat topped mountain, just at the surroundings, overlooking Cape Town as a city, right? So it's incredible. I mean, I'm already dazzled by some of the history of Cape Town and South Africa, and the fact that there used to be like lions in those mountains. I think they used to have like black manes, if I'm correct in remembering what
Yes,
people.
the now extinct Cape lion, which was native to these parts and a little bit up into the Kalahari, had a very much darker black kind of mane and quite a different face to like what people would think a lion looks like. It had actually more of a squashed in kind of, uh, I wouldn't say like a bulldog, but it had a bit more of a squashed in kind of
Like
face
a
as opposed
flat
to a
nose.
normal. Yeah, that's it, a flat nosed lion. Yeah,
Interesting. I mean, so the context of which being that these lions are roaming around, there's a lot of wild animals still, and this guy's just living for 40 years up on the top of this mountain, way away from everyone else, just looking down on. He must have, for those 40 years, been watching civilization grow from afar. It's interesting.
yeah, yeah. I think he was kind of like a Davy Crockett kind of character, although he definitely didn't wear a raccoon hat. Um, he was very distinct in his appearance, apparently. He used to wear a very long, dark overcoat with a black peak sailor's cap, black sea boots, used to carry a walking stick and a sack that he would put all his plants and mushrooms into, and a complete genius. I've interviewed a few elderly residents who still remember him. He passed away in 1956,
Oh,
and they said
wow.
that he had an incredible sense of like an acceptance of life. He was like on the level of being a reclusive absolute genius who I think could have been one of the greatest unsung geniuses of Cape Town or of that time. Like no one ever really heard about him, but apparently he was profoundly wise.
That's so interesting. And it's
Yeah.
interesting that, yeah, that you've kind of, he is who you hold up as your like main teacher, and the things that he's been able to share with you through, I guess, writings and various other
Yeah.
information. But so I'm
Yeah.
curious then, he was your teacher. At what point was it that you felt comfortable to start teaching the things that you'd learned about mushrooms and the mushroom world?
I started teaching in 2015, so that's almost 10 years ago. I began, I guess, showcasing a lot of my finds of foraging and the places I was visiting. I guess I started kind of broadcasting a lot of that on Facebook and Instagram, and word started getting around about this guy who was very big into mushrooms. He was obsessive about them, of which there weren't too many people kind of blasting mushroom content in those days. I was one of the few doing that. And a friend of a friend heard about me, and she grew up. She's from a town not too far from where I grew up. Her name is Rishana. She runs a business called Fulton Sea. And she, I would say, is one of the most knowledgeable coastal foragers and fynbos kind of experts in South Africa. And she was already hosting coastal foraging events where guests could experience shoreline foraging, sea vegetables like samphire, dune spinach, mussels, uni. She was already well entrenched into that field at the time. And she approached me and said, would you like to meet up, chat, go for a walk together in the woods and pick some mushrooms together? Likewise, come and pick some mollusks together and cook together. So we became very good friends after that. And it was a while later when she said, well, would you like to start collaborating and hosting some workshops together or foraging events? It wasn't really being done in Cape Town at the time. There was one or two teachers around, but they didn't really do it at the scale how she does it, or in the beautiful settings or experience that how she quite does it herself. So we did it, we collaborated, guests loved it, and I have never really looked back. We collaborate every year. We host about 8 to 10 foraging, I guess, forays, you could call them. And we've just been growing strength from strength each year, more and more interest, refining our offering, delighting guests, cooking for them, catering, and just sharing the world of mushrooms and sharing our passion with them.
It's
Yeah.
so nice as well that you sort of, I can imagine in that situation, it takes a bit of someone giving you a nudge to just jump in and start feeling like you have enough of a resource of knowledge and experience to share that with people. So it was great that she was able to just push you in the right direction there. So that's cool.
Yeah. Yeah, no, she's been an absolute blessing, and it's been really good to see other teachers emerge. In the last few years, I'd say since COVID started, 2020, there've definitely been more mushroom teachers emerge from here in Cape Town and other parts of South Africa, and it's just been great to see and to know that people like Rishana Gray and myself have helped to open the door for, I wouldn't say the next generation, but younger people interested in the field and on their own journeys and doing what they do. It's been so cool to watch that.
I think that's your humble nature coming through because that is the next generation. I mean, it's just the way it goes, isn't it? You learn things and then
Yeah,
you share them and then people take it on. So it's
yeah.
commendable. Good stuff, man.
Cheers. Thank you.
So there's a little section I'd love to get into now, which is we've heard the kind of arc of your progression in the mushroom world, but I'd love to hear some stories if you have them. I know you do. You've told me a few of them already, and I'd love to
I
share them
do.
again. So
Yes.
I guess first of all, I mean, you're out in the wild looking for mushrooms a lot, so there must have been some fun interactions with animals or things in the area. Any of them pop into mind?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There've been many encounters with animals. I mean, here in Cape Town, our most prevalent, I guess, wild animals that we come face to face with are animals like baboons. The
Okay.
Kakma baboon is resident here on the Cape Peninsula, and they're quite chilled for the most part. But if you have food on your person, they will probably they could try and grab it from you, and they're extremely strong animals. So it's always a bad idea to try and refuse food if they come up to you. I have been encircled by a troop of baboons before, and I was rather scared because I was foraging by myself at a time in quite a remote place. So I was quite nervous, but I was fine. They didn't do anything to me. Snakes are very much a part of foraging here in Cape Town and South Africa. We have three deadly poisonous species native to here. The first is the
Okay.
Cape Cobra, the second is the puff adder, and the third is the boomslang or tree snake. And I've
Okay.
encountered I've encountered two out of three of those face to face while foraging before. The scariest one is the Cape Cobra. Um, it's very lethal. Like having a bite, you've got 1 to 2 hours to act. Otherwise, you'll go downhill very quickly.
Ugh.
I have never been bitten by a snake, but there've been too many close calls for comfort. A few years ago, my wife and I were foraging at a local spot here called Newlands Forest, and it's a beautiful pine plantation. But below the plantation, to get into it, you have to go through an indigenous forest, which consists of native hardwood trees. And I was walking in front of my wife, and she said to me all of a sudden, "Stop." And I stopped dead in my tracks because I know what that stop means. There's a snake around. There's just a certain kind of like frequency or pitch to someone's voice when they're like, "Stop." And I stopped and I looked down, and there was a puff adder between my legs. Like I'd actually completely I stepped over it. And it's quite a hectic experience because it was a young puff adder. And the problem with a young puff adder is that when they're so young, they don't know how to regulate the amount of venom that they exude per bite. A big male or adult female, any kind of bigger snake would know that striking such a big human or animal won't be worth it. They probably won't come out of as the victor in a battle with them. So they'll generally slither away. But a young snake will give its full amount of venom in a bite, which is really bad because you never want to be bitten with a full amount of venom. And youngsters don't know how to regulate that. So I
Oh,
was literally centimeters away from stepping on one of them, and their reaction as soon as you step on one of them is to immediately fangs in your calf muscle or fangs in your ankle.
oh.
And then in the garden route, Neisner Forest, also coming face to face with wormslungs or tree snakes, nearly stepping on one on the ground as well, and puff adders. Yeah, I mean there've been plenty, man. And I'm getting like the heebie-jeebies, like just thinking about those experiences. But it makes it all kind of worthwhile when you go foraging into nature. The good comes with the bad. It's all part of the greater scene. It would be great if there were no snakes around, but they all are necessary, just as we are in that space. So they have
Yeah.
to be respected, and you have to trade carefully. So I look now to look up and down around, and just kind of be very pedantic when going into a spot.
Yeah, definitely. It's a thing which I think, coming from England myself, which is the land of no dangerous animals whatsoever.
Sounds lovely.
Well, yeah, there's other things like perpetual rainfall. But
Good for mushrooms.
true, true. The thing that's funny about that kind of that environment growing up is that you don't have it ingrained in your brain. And the funny thing is, I'm married to a South African, and so she has that in her head that we are hiking, could be anywhere. I mean, we live in the US now in California, but if we're hiking around an area, she is like on autopilot, just looking for snakes. And I've had to like learn that now. And I think from the last 7, 8, 9 years of living in places where there are snakes, it's become more ingrained in me. But
Yeah.
definitely, there was a period where it's hard to switch that on, and it's hard work to be thinking about that just with that lens all the time. And so it
Yeah.
takes a few interactions. Like for instance, in Cape Town, I've been very close to a dancing Cape Cobra where,
Oh,
and they, in my wisdom, I was like, oh, let's just, I think we were on Signal Hill, which is just a
yeah.
little hill next to Table Mountain. And we'd gone off trail, and as usual, I usually like to do this. So I was taking my wife on, like, oh, let's go around this way, and oh, we'll just go up this dry riverbed. And we got about halfway up there, and classic. And it wasn't the first time that this kind of thing's happened before, if I'm honest.
Oh.
But suddenly a cobra is dancing in front of me, and I believe at that time I was fascinated because, I mean, it's amazing. I can see this snake. It's probably 1.5 meters away, 4 or 5 feet away. It seems like a safe distance, and it's dancing and doing its whole performance, and doesn't look very happy. But I'm just like, I'm not giving any aggressive behavior. I'm just like watching the show. I'm like telling my
Yeah.
wife, who happens to have a phobia of snakes, wow, look at this. This is cobra dancing in front of us. And the funny thing is, I asked her after, she didn't even see the snake because she heard the word cobra and she just turned and ran. She didn't even like look. There wasn't a moment of curiosity at all. So, but the funny thing was, I was having this moment thinking, oh, this is amazing. But the cobra then like chased me. Like it actually just like
Really?
it just ran at me. I don't know if it was
Oh
running at me
man.
or if that was like looking for an exit strategy, but that was some aggressive behavior. So I then
Yeah.
was also turning tail and running as fast as I could away from this thing. Because they're pretty quick, man.
They really are. They are deceptively fast. How good did you feel when you realized that it was no longer around? Like you must have felt pretty relieved and oh my
Yeah.
God, like that was a crazy experience. We're like, wow. I mean, it leaves you quite like shook. Like it's quite a surreal experience seeing a deadly venomous snake up so close.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, man, it's wild. But like when you're walking around any part of the wild, I mean, except for England, Ireland, maybe New Zealand, where there are no native snakes,
Yeah.
it's always good to just be cognizant of your surroundings and what is around. I think one more thing I'd like to add, Robin,
Yeah.
about wildlife and nature. The one thing that's worse for me than a snake are ticks. Ticks
Yeah.
are so bad. I've been bitten by ticks a few times. Here in South Africa, what we call tick bite fever
Hmm.
is quite a common illness that people get from being bitten by a tick. I don't think we have Lyme disease per se here. Maybe we do. I just don't know about it. But I read somewhere that ticks can carry many thousands of unknown pathogenic viruses, just unknown to science at this point. And I've
Yeah.
spoken to a number of people over the years who have been bitten by ticks, and it has permanently affected their diet. One guy I spoke to got bitten by a tick, got tick bite fever afterwards, and he could never eat red meat ever again because every time he ate red meat, he would just feel violently ill. So
Wow.
they work in mysterious ways. So if I had my way, I mean, I wouldn't say I'd be rather bitten by a snake than a tick. I'd be rather bitten by neither. But ticks are really badass. And I would advise anybody listening who wants to go out foraging, just protect yourself against ticks. You know, put your socks over your pants, tuck your shirt in, use a kind of repellent if you can, and just really take precaution because they're so mysteriously unknown and what they can do to the human body.
Yeah, it's definitely it's one of those tricky things, isn't it? Because I think it's obvious you and I both love going outdoors, and you can't stay inside hiding away from the ticks. But it's kind of unavoidable. I do all of the things that you mentioned, and still, even the last time I was out looking for mushrooms, I found a tick. And they get you every now and then, and it does create that
Yeah.
little thing in your mind where you're like, oh,
Yeah.
what was in that
Yeah.
tick? Usually, I find them pretty
Yeah.
quickly, so I tell myself that helps.
100%. Yeah.
So you also, I mean, by all means, we're in this story section at the moment. Like, I'd love to hear if you have any other stories of traveling around South Africa or other, other provinces or in Cape Town. If there's any other kind of moments that you spring to mind when out looking for mushrooms, or even, I know you spent time looking for fragrances in nature too. But any kind of stuff that springs to mind there was always good.
Yeah, I think I would love to explore a lot more South Africa, my home country still. There's a lot more I need to see. I have foraged quite extensively and gone looking for mushrooms around the Garden Route, which is a region that straddles both the Western Cape province and the Eastern Cape province. And there's a very cool kind of aspect to foraging in that area because they receive both summer rainfall and winter rainfall. And the thing that separates South Africa from a foraging perspective is that the Western Cape has a Mediterranean climate. It receives hot, dry summers, cold, wet winters, whereas most of the country receives hot, wet summers, cold, dry winters. But the garden route actually is blessed with both of these kind of temperate conditions and has rainfall most of the year round. So that gives a lot of kind of opportunities to finding summer fruiting mushrooms that you wouldn't find in Cape Town and other kinds of species that you wouldn't really find further abroad up country. So the mushroom that I most like to eat that grows around the garden route is Tomatomyces umkowan, which is known as the Natal beefsteak mushroom.
Oh, cool.
And it's a species that doesn't grow here in Cape Town. It requires summer rainfall, and it's symbiotic with a species of termite and delicious to eat. That's the one I have located around a few parts of the country. I've also gone foraging in another province here called Mpumalanga, which is not too far from Johannesburg. It's definitely way north of the country, and they have some interesting species there as well, introduced and native. They have about 5 different species of edible termite mushroom or Tomatomyces, as well as some introduced species like your chestnut bolete or Gyroporus castaneus, a type of amanita called Amanita flavoconia that you just will not find in the Western Cape. So I have done some exploring around my country. I'd like to do a lot more. I have had some magical experiences foraging on holiday around parts of Europe. I must say, like, I think my peak foraging moments were foraging in Europe just to see the culture, how mushroom cultures are up there, the farmers markets, meeting other foragers in the woods of Croatia and Slovenia. Um, it just blew me away seeing mushrooming done differently in areas where it's been done for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's like baked into the culture. It's very different in
Yes.
Cape Town here. You know, there isn't much of a mushroom culture here that's been baked in for many, many generations. It's still very
Mm.
new. But in places like Slovenia, everybody knows what a chanterelle is. Everybody knows what a black trumpet is. In Croatia, everybody knows what a Caesar's amanita is. So it was really cool experiencing these foraging kind of moments in those parts of the world.
That's so interesting. Was it I mean, you must have done some research beforehand. What was it that made you choose those places? I mean, it's a great commitment. I love it that like to go traveling and be like, oh, while we're there, let's do some mushroom hunting. Or was it that you were like, we're going there for mushrooms? What was the motivation? And
I
where did you
think,
get the information for that?
yeah, I think maybe it was like a Venn diagram with like affordability for a South African traveler on a rand budget, and is it mushroom season, and what mushrooms grow in which part of Europe. So I think all these kind of factors align into being Croatia is affordable for us South Africans to travel to
Yes.
because at the time they didn't use the euro, they used the kuna, which was a bit more affordable for us to kind of leverage for a holiday. And Slovenia was just a very forested, beautiful, lakey kind of nation that we were really wanted to see for a long time. So we coincided our trip in early October 2019, which was truffle season at the same time as well. And man, just to be able to see white truffles in person, getting to experience them on a fresh bowl of pasta, picking chanterelles for the first time, it was mind-blowingly cool. And I really want to go back. That's the hardest part. Is like, once you've gotten a taste of the honey, you want the whole beehive. So I can't wait to go back.
I love it, like a dedicated mushroom bear.
Yeah.
um, so you did tell me though, like that from those travels, you had a lot of cool experiences picking a bunch of interesting mushrooms, but you also had a bit of a hairy moment while you were over there, didn't you?
I did, yeah. So my wife and I were in Croatia and we were in a certain town not too far from the peninsula of Istria, which is very much known as the white truffle kind of country. And I guess we didn't know fully at the time that farm owners and landowners are very particular about who goes onto their land to pick truffles because this is a big business. There's an industry for it there locally. And I guess you could say we bumbled upon this area where white truffles were growing. And there were signs all around in Croatian saying private property, but we didn't know at the time. I took a photo of the signs, and when we came back, I looked it up as, oh, it's a private property. Trespassers will be shot. So I
Okay.
guess I guess like the story is that we were trying to find truffles in a private oak plantation or oak forest,
Okay.
and a truck with a few guys who were armed kind of drove past, and we had to hide down in the bushes to not be seen because I'm almost certain that they would have probably fired a few shots at us if they'd seen us trying to find their truffles. So that really was a scary moment, like lying face down on the ground, not to be seen because we wouldn't have been able to speak to them in Croatian. They would have asked us what we're doing there. There would have been a breakdown in communication, and it could have gotten really, really bad. So that was a hairy moment, like seeing armed people protecting their truffle grounds, and we were literally in there trying to steal truffles, quite innocently, I might add.
Very innocently, very innocently. But even more, the thing is, if I remember from when you told me this story before, it was even more innocently than how you told it because you did actually go to a farmer's market or some kind and spoke to a woman who had mushrooms and
Yes,
said, "Oh, is there? We'd love to pick some mushrooms. Is there anywhere where you'd recommend for us to go and check out?" So this
yeah.
cute old lady told you, "Oh yeah, let's just go over there." And little did you know that you're walking into a potential war zone.
That's right. She was a very sweet lady. We walked around the local market in the town of Pula in Croatia, and I knew there were some amazing spots to forage around there. I just didn't know exactly where to enter into the forest or where exactly to go. Probably a bit of a lazy move on my behalf, but I asked this really sweet lady who was selling all kinds of honey, lavender honey, citrus honey, and so on. And I said to her, "Where's a good place to find mushrooms?" And she said, "You have to go to this one kind of forest. I'll give you the name." And she wrote it on a piece of paper for us. And we arrived in this region or area with the same name, drove along the road, went off onto a gravel path, and eventually we found ourselves in this oak forest. And I was like, cool, this is the place. And we started seeing mushrooms, and that's where it took place. So I don't think she would really like specified like don't go into a private property. She's just like, you can find mushrooms in this general area. And we
Okay.
kind of bumbled our way into this private area. And yeah, the rest is history.
Oh, that's brilliant, man. I love it. Well, thanks for sharing those stories, man. I always love to hear
Cool.
those moments, the mischief that people get up to along their travels in search of
Yeah.
nutrition. So it's always nice. Like I love to hear people's stories, but it's also trying to extract some of the skills and some of the knowledge that people are so willing to share. I must say, like it's been very nice. I'm setting it up big now, but but I'd love to, yeah, for people who are thinking about coming to South Africa, or people who already live in South Africa and are curious about mushroom hunting, or even people who know about it already but just want to hear a bit more nuanced information. I'd love to pick your brains about how the whole mushrooming thing works. So I guess the best thing to start with is maybe what are the most common mushrooms in the Western Cape, and then we can go from there. Also, yeah, and we can talk about seasons and other things as well. But I guess just starting there is probably a good place to go. You mentioned a lot already,
Yeah.
so but I think just going in a bit more of a like a specific way might be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. I think a lot of people are exposed to mushrooms from the beginning by what grows around their gardens and neighborhoods and parks, sports fields, other suburban areas where mushrooms have a tendency of growing. These are the places where people first see them, myself included. The Coprinus comatus that I came across as a youngster, I tried to eat. That's one species that has a tendency to grow. It's fairly widespread around the country. And I think it's a very common mushroom that's you can't really mistake with anything else. Then you get another kind of mushroom called Agaricus campestris, or your meadow mushroom or field mushroom. It has a few different common names. And this is a wild cousin, really, of your white button mushroom you can buy at a supermarket. Those are
Okay.
quite common around parks and fields. They grow out in the open, in the sun, and not really so much in the shade. And then those are two edible species I've spoken about. There are plenty of inedible species that also grow.
I have a quick question. You said
Yeah, shoot.
Capri Capriacus
Co-
comatus, is that correct?
Coprinus comatus.
Caprinus comatus. Is there
Yes.
like well, I don't even know the word for like the normal word. Is there a normal word for that mushroom, or is it just everyone calls it by that name?
Shaggy mane is its
Oh,
common
shaggy
name.
mane. Okay, I should know
Yeah.
that.
It's also called a lawyer's wig is another common name because it has like this fluffy textured appearance of like an old school
Yeah.
17th century kind of like lawyer's wig, you know?
I can imagine it was
Yeah.
probably discovered back in the day where they're like, oh yeah, it's just a lawyer's wig, like
Yeah.
everyone wears these days.
Yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, that's
Okay,
it.
sorry, I
Um,
interrupted you. So you said that those are the two most common
two most
edibles.
common edibles that people, I guess, are most likely to find when walking around their neighborhoods in South Africa. But it's quite worrying sometimes. People would send me a photo of like, "Hey, Justin, I've got this growing out of my house plant. What is this?" And it's actually a deadly poisonous species called Foliotina rugosa. I don't know the common name for that one. I'm so sorry,
No, no,
but
don't worry.
it's a very small brown mushroom that has a ring around its stem or stipe, and it has a tendency to grow from pot plants or house plants in people's houses. And there've been a few times where a mother would message me and say, "Hey, my toddler picked this mushroom. Haven't put it into their mouth. What should I do with it? Should I throw it away, or is it safe for the toddler to eat?" So I said, "Well, no mushroom's ever safe for a toddler to eat raw. They should definitely not do that." But alarmingly enough, it's a deadly poisonous species that grows very, very commonly in our homes. And
Wow.
the reason why that happens is because their spores are sometimes present in compost and other kind of potting mediums. And after being watered, the mycelium will start to be triggered and cause itself to grow fruit, which are the mushrooms themselves. So that's a fairly common occurrence in people's homes. Then on sports fields, there's another mushroom called sunny side up, or Bulbituous titubans. It's a small little yellow mushroom that's not toxic, but I don't think it's really gathered to eat. It's so small and flimsy, very common after rain in grassy areas. And then the other mushrooms, I guess, after that are quite a lot more specialized.
Okay.
You would need to know where to go to a certain kind of forest where there's a certain tree growing,
Yeah.
or into a certain kind of paddock where there are animals grazing because of their manure. Some mushrooms really enjoy growing around those habitats. So everything after that, I'd say, is more targeted.
So what are the mushrooms that local mushroom hunters often pursue? Like, what's the kind of usual game on the menu that they're searching
Yeah.
for?
So I guess there's like a three-way tussle
Okay.
between what's the best edible mushroom in South Africa. There's a three-way contest. The first species is very widespread around the country. It's the Natal beefsteak mushroom, the one that I referenced a bit earlier that grows in the garden route.
Okay.
Tomatomyces umkowan is its scientific name, and it is an absolutely delicious one to eat. And it grows in the presence of a certain species of termite. So where these termites are present, generally you would find these mushrooms growing after spring rain, especially after a lightning storm. It just kind of really jolts the mycelium into action and begins to get them growing. So that's one, the Natal beefsteak, really delicious to eat, fairly common and widespread and fairly plentiful in some parts of the country. Then there's the famous porcini or Boletus edulis, which has been introduced to South Africa. It's not
Okay.
a native species. It was actually introduced here from when the first pine trees and oak trees were brought here from Europe by very early European settlers. They uprooted these trees from European forests, tiny pine saplings, small oak trees, brought them here to South Africa, established them in plantations. Little did they know that they were also introducing the mycelium, which was already embedded onto the roots of these small saplings. So once they established these plantations here, these trees grew, so did the mycelial networks. And as a result, we have a very nice internationally known delicacy, the porcini or king bolete, which grows fairly plentifully here in the Western Cape and a few other provinces in South Africa. So that's
Amazing.
second. Yeah, that's the second one. The third one is a morel mushroom. And it's a fairly new discovery. And I'd say that it wasn't completely brand new, but it was only, I'd say, the last 10 years or so where people have really gotten to know that morel mushrooms grow in South Africa. And as you would know, these are mushrooms that are highly prized in other markets around the world. And it's truly delicious to eat. Between those three, the Natal beefsteak, the porcini, and the morel, I would say those are the best ones to find and what people are generally going out to hopefully accomplish to find one of those three different species, no matter where they are in the country.
That's so cool. It's so nice that I mean, getting mycorrhizal, yeah, porcini arriving and then just yeah, being in those forests. That's so nice because I mean, I love that mushroom. We get them here. We get them here as well over in Northern California on the coast, and it's always a good day when you find some of those. Oh, so tasty.
Oh, they're wonderful. Yeah. Let me add on like a little bit more into this happenstance that happened with the accidental introduction of mycorrhizal organisms to this country. Not only did porcini arrive, but so did saffron milkcaps, which are these beautiful orange mushrooms that grow predominantly, or I guess strictly with certain species of pine tree. A lot of people collect those as well. It's the national mushroom of Spain and several Eastern European nations. They absolutely love them. And it's a really delicious mushroom to find here. So between porcini and saffron milkcaps, we've been accidentally blessed with choice edibles growing right here. So just wanted to give some love to the saffron milkcaps.
That's so cool. So each of these species, like, are there areas that like common areas? You're saying like being connected with certain trees, and obviously you said the pine forests for the porcini. Forgive me if you already said with the saffron milk caps, but where do they? Is there something that they are specifically connected with now that is like you're looking for that in nature? Like that's the clue.
That's right. Yeah. So, like a very good rule of thumb when starting to go foraging is to look for a safe species of mushroom to eat. I think that's the big takeout.
Hmm.
But knowing which types of trees can harbor which species of mushroom, I think that's one of the kind of artistic touches when it comes to foraging. So if I go to a certain forested area and I know there's a certain kind of tree, I will go to that area at a certain time of year when I know that there's a high chance that a certain kind of mushroom will be appearing out of the ground. Case in point with porcini, I know that when it's been raining X amount at a certain time of year, it almost becomes formulaic, where I know if I go out, I'll almost certainly find porcini mushrooms growing, unless somebody's beating me to it. But I will go out and find mushrooms. And really, it comes with understanding the tree, knowing what kind of tree to look for when it comes down to mycorrhizal species.
Yeah.
So, what's interesting about the porcini is that porcini refers to Boletus edulis as a species,
Hmm.
but here we also have about at least three different other species of Boletus, which are equally as delicious, that also grow with slightly different kinds of trees. We have one called Boletus aereus, which is a chocolate brown capped Boletus, which is actually even better than Boletus edulis, in my opinion. And there's another one called Boletus reticulatus, or the summer bolete. And they all kind of grow with certain kinds of introduced trees. So it's a case of locating those trees and then hopefully finding the mushrooms underneath them.
Okay. And do you
Yeah.
mind like this? So maybe this is your trade secrets, but do you mind like saying which trees are the ones which are like classic giveaways for the mushrooms, or is that
Yeah.
something you want to keep for when you're when you're guiding?
No, I'll happily share it. That's totally okay. So when it comes to oak trees, the genus of oak is called Quercus,
Yeah.
and Quercus robur is your English oak, or yeah, English oak is its common name. You can very often find Boletus reticulatus or your summer bolete growing with those.
Okay.
as well as your chestnut bolete, which is not a boletus, it's called Gyroporus castaneus, which comes from southern Europe. Delicious to eat, has a bolete-like appearance. But when it comes to pine trees, it's slightly different. I will look for things like Pinus radiata, which is a certain species of pine that
Okay.
has been known to harbor Boletus edulis and saffron milkcaps and Boletus aereus, which is your queen bolete as its common name. So I think the art is knowing which trees can harbor which mushrooms and
Yeah.
checking back into those spots over time to get a full understanding of what's presently existing in that forest.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's interesting as well because a lot of this aligns with the things that I've spoken with my West Coast of America mushroom expert Billy, who
Yeah,
has it's so interesting. He is mushroom hunting even during, off season because he's looking around and he's looking at what trees and what plants are around and he's understanding, okay, this is the good terrain, this is the good topography, and this is so I can see, he said to me before, but actually now I went hunting with him the other day. The most interesting thing about hunting with Billy was when he's looking for mushrooms, he's not looking down at the ground. He's looking up all the time. He's looking up around everywhere, looking to his left, look to his right. He's scanning because he's just like reading the forest, which I mean, I'm sure it sounds like that's exactly what you must be doing when you're looking for mushrooms too. It's counter to what you might
100%.
think.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, that there's so many nuances when it comes to reading the land and typography. I think the best tips I can share is that, where I am now in the Southern Hemisphere, our south-facing slopes of hillsides and mountains are generally more damp and moist, whereas in the Northern Hemisphere, those will be your north-facing slopes. So those are always kind of good areas to go looking in, is your north in the Northern Hemisphere or south in the Southern Hemisphere facing slopes, because they're just more damp and cool and shaded.
Yes.
Then looking left and right up above for the right kind of tree. And sometimes there's some mushrooms that have a tendency to grow out in the open where it's not shaded. So maybe at the edge of a forest where there's a mix of other vegetation meeting the forest, you can sometimes find certain species growing because they like this mix of vegetation and maybe a bit more of open, not so dappled light. So there's so many nuances. And then animals, of course, like
Mm.
porcupines we get here quite a bit. Seeing the remnants of porcupines eating porcini, it's a dead giveaway that, there's definitely porcini here because a porcupine has ravaged the hall before us. So there are lots of clues.
Extra competition.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, thanks for sharing that, man. The
Cool.
I guess another general thing which is good for people to know, and this might be obvious, but say for the Western Cape, when is that season? Like what's the kind of when does that spread? Like what months is that?
Yeah, our traditional mushroom season in the Western Cape is after our first big autumn rains. Now, because we have a Mediterranean climate here, really hot, dry, windy summers, that changes usually around April or March. It's actually happened this week where we received our first big autumn rains of the season.
Mm.
And I will typically go start looking for mushrooms 4 or 5 days later, from the first flush. So usually it's about 30 to 40 milliliters of rain has fallen. I I will look to see how much has exactly fallen, and then I will start going to my spots with the expectation about knowing what to find. So the very first mushroom I'll start finding after rain would be the prince mushroom. Um, Sorry, not a prince mushroom, an almond mushroom. I got confused there. They're both species of agaricus. One is highly prized where you are in California, the prince mushroom, Agaricus augustus, very almondy, sweet tasting mushroom. There's a sister one to that called the almond agaricus or Agaricus abrufescens. That grows here when it's still nice and warm in the daytime. And we've just had a lot of rain come through. I will start looking for that. And I'm actually going out tomorrow to start looking for almond agaricus. So we've just come off our end of chicken of the woods season. I mentioned earlier we have the summertime mushroom called chicken of the woods.
Yeah.
That season's now coming to an end, and soon we'll start seeing a lot more porcini come about with the change of season. Because like I guess we're in complete polar opposites right now. Your spring is emerging soon. Our autumn is emerging soon as well. So like there's this excitement, going around. Mushroom season is starting soon for both of us, and I think that's always a cool thing about changing of the seasons. Mushrooms love it as well. When one season changes into the next, whether it gets cooler or warmer, generally fungi tend to respond to these changes in temperature and moisture and humidity, which makes it so fun to go out and explore them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, man. I was fearful, given traveling around to South Africa, that I was going to be missing the action in both places, perpetually skipping, which, I mean, I can't complain. It's a nice situation to be in, of course. But yeah, I was grateful to be able to sneak in a few more mushroom hunts before the black trumpet season winds down over this end. But
That must have been unreal though, like Robin, like black trumpets. Sorry, just to kind of drive home a point, like black trumpets are honestly one of the best mushrooms I've ever tasted. They don't grow in South Africa, which really sucks, but I haven't tasted many mushrooms that are as good as black trumpets. For me, they're pretty much on top of the pyramid. You know, maybe morels are close by and truffles are close by, but pound for pound, black trumpets have something so unique to give to the palate, that like that smoky, earthy,
yeah,
slightly bacon flavor.
yeah,
Oh
umami.
man, they're so magical. Yeah,
Yeah, they're delicious. I have to say, I've been having had so many of them. I've been experimenting lots of different ways to to enjoy them. Yeah, they're
yeah,
fantastic. Um, some, Something I was going to ask as well is you mentioned, and you've touched on this before, but it's probably helpful to just kind of pad it out. The
yeah.
the season that you mentioned there was like the Western Cape, but it is actually different, right?
Yes,
Johannesburg is very different, and I mean, I don't know if East London, because that's closer to the other ocean, is the Indian Ocean. Is that correct? I'm not
that's
sure.
right.
So,
Well,
so,
sorry. Yeah, what was the question again?
so, yeah, I haven't quite got to the question yet.
Oh, right.
I was just
Sorry.
figuring out what I was figuring out the geography in my head before asking. Forgive me for
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So the question is, that's the you've explained what the season is in the Western Cape, but in Joburg
Yeah.
it's quite different, right? The weather is season.
Yes.
It's almost, yeah. I mean, it's not like a lot of the US. There's kind of a lot of similarities, at least. I mean, more extremes in cold and wet and all those kinds of things. But
Mhm.
the overall dynamic of the season is similar, whereas it can be quite different in South Africa, right?
That's right. Yeah. So Joburg season pretty much starts, I'd say, around September, when their first spring rains roll through. Because they have such a different climate to here in Cape Town, they have cold, dry winters. No mushroom action really happens throughout the winter in Joburg. They have a lot of frost up there.
Okay.
But, when it starts getting a bit warmer, when September rolls through, which is spring, um, a lot of cold fronts start passing through, lightning storms, and these conditions really start jolting the mushrooms alive, or awake rather. So September, October is when the season starts, and their season extends throughout summer, with their warmer temperatures and a lot of kind of weather patterns passing through, bringing a lot of rain. Their season lasts from like September typically until like February or March, even. When our season starts kicking off, their one is winding down. So it's like this continuous cycle between two different parts of Africa, with mushroom seasons rolling in all the time. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's ideal if someone is an avid mushroomer and they happen to be going to South Africa. It's like there will always be something somewhere.
Yeah,
If you're
exactly.
committed enough, you can travel a bit and
Yeah,
find a place where they're popping. That's
yeah,
that's great. So the other thing I'm curious about, and we touched on it a little bit before, but the whole way, like, how does mushrooming work in general? Because in the US, there's like vast, particularly where I am, there's vast amounts of public land, and there's lots of big areas of land just available that you can go searching for mushrooms. How does it work in South Africa? I mean, I'm guessing it's a sort of more highly populated area. Is there, and at least in my experience, there isn't as much public land. Is that correct?
that's right. Yeah, much less public land. A lot of rural South Africa is farmland. And hunting for mushrooms is quite tricky at times, because often your pine plantations where the best mushrooms grow are in a protected national park or reserve. So you would need explicit permission to go foraging in these places.
Oh,
For
okay.
example, here down the road, there's a very popular spot to go foraging called Newlands Forest, where porcini grows abundantly. But mushroom pickers are they're obliged, I'd say, to get a permit, which doesn't cost anything. It's free to get. and it entitles you to collect, like, they keep on changing it each year. I think it's like 3 porcini a day and 5 saffron caps a day, but they keep on changing it. It's hard to keep up. But I think what I was getting at is that you do need a permit oftentimes to go foraging in the more popular places. What I like to do is find off the beaten track, more hidden kinds of places where you don't need a permit to go foraging, open municipal land. And those places do exist here in Cape Town if you know where to look. Um, but yeah, it's a good balance, going to the more, I guess, very popular spots where you're bumping shoulders with lots of other people foraging and learning about mushrooms, and me going solo into a secret hidden spot where no one else knows about and finding my mushrooms there. So I guess it's a nice balance between the two.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had no idea that there was actually like a quota, like for mushrooms, because I mean for me that sounds more like fishing seasons and that kind of thing, where it's you get
Yeah,
your bag limit effectively.
yeah,
That's so
yeah,
curious. So
yeah.
I guess that's a way of managing people just coming in and taking everything, and sort of taking the fun away for people.
It's kind of weird because, applying a fishing mentality to mushrooms doesn't always work, because I think what often the authorities don't always understand, and I'm not saying that this is definitely the case, but what they don't always realize is that picking a porcini mushroom is no better than picking a dandelion weed or picking any kind of weed growing from the ground. This is an organism that's been accidentally introduced here. There's no environmental impact from collecting these mushrooms because they don't actually belong here. But applying a quota system to essentially weed picking is kind of bizarre. So I've had very interesting, I guess, conversations, you could say, over the years with park rangers wanting to know, why am I picking mushrooms? And even though I have a permit, at times they don't really understand the mycelial kind of side of it and why the mushrooms are growing here, where they came from in the first place. So I think a lot more education needs to be driven home by large with parks and reserves here in South Africa. And I think, through my work and others like me, we hopefully are really driving that home for them over time to do away with quota systems and more look at it as a case of, we're picking weeds. If you want to clear out the forest commercially, that sucks. It's not great for the others. But we want to try and instill a sense of respectful foraging. Take what you need, or um, share your haul with others. Like, I think little things like that help pay it forward and give you good karma at the end of the day.
I think that it makes absolute sense, and it's a good way to be thinking about things. But I'm curious, if there's commercial pickers, how do the limits apply to them, or do they have to have a different kind of license?
Oh man, I think admittedly they just pick without any consequence.
Oh, okay.
There are not many of them around, commercial pickers in Cape Town, because the foraging grounds are so slim.
Hmm.
I guess you could say a critical mass has been reached in recent times, where the amount of foraging grounds are becoming less because we have these introduced pine trees and oak trees. Fires have kind of ravaged a lot of these places over the last few years. So there's no more pine plantation. There's very few left compared to what there used to be. So the foraging grounds are getting less, but more and more people are getting into foraging. So we've reached this weird kind of gray area now where foraging areas are very small, and people commercially picking in those areas, there's not too much to pick for them because they've got so many other people
Yeah.
visiting those areas that
Yeah. Yeah.
it's not really a viable venture trying to hopefully pick a lot of mushrooms to try and make a bit of an income. So those who aren't doing it still aren't making a lot of money from it at all. They're making really just pocket money from picking a few porcini, waltzing into a restaurant. That's what I used to do. And then ultimately I realized that it's not a sustainable form of income because
Yeah.
it's the supply is so unpredictable. You just don't know what you're going to get. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. It's a good point. I guess it's obvious that if the supply isn't there, then that's going to mean that it sort of extinguishes itself as an issue. It will no longer
Yeah.
be a problem. So I was
Yeah.
going to ask then, if with
Mm.
that confined space and a, a blooming enthusiasm for picking mushrooms, you've told me about this before. I think you've had some issues. There can at times be some prickly interactions between mushroom hunters. Like, I mean, I have a note
Yeah.
here: mushroom turf wars. I think that might be an exaggeration. But could you tell me a little bit about like what can potentially happen there sometimes.
Yeah, I think it all comes down to profit generation. You know, every time that I've had a bit of a run-in or an altercation with another forager, it's usually been about commercial picking. Whether it was me in my earlier days trying to make some pocket money, bumping into other commercial pickers who are also trying to make their own pocket money. I think there is definitely a level of competition here in South Africa about mushrooms. And because it's really an unknown field by large in South Africa, there aren't too many people into mushrooms in South Africa, but it's growing now. There's been a bit of a vacuum, and a few people have come out over the years, with a lot of knowledge. And from what I've seen, they can be a bit threatened by other people coming out also with a lot of knowledge. And I've certainly experienced it myself where coming out and starting to teach people, I guess what I was doing by teaching others and becoming more known as a forager is treading on the toes of people who were doing it before I was doing it. So I have certainly come across turf wars. I've heard about politics in the mushroom scene. To be honest, in recent times, I've completely removed myself from a lot of different forums with regards to mushrooms online locally, purely because a lot of knowledge is wrong that gets shared, admittedly, and not all the knowledgeable experts have time to correct those who are wrong. So a lot of people get into mushrooms very quickly. They absorb a lot of knowledge. They're not truly ready to start correcting others or making positive identifications, but they've got the confidence to make it seem like they do have it. So a lot of kind of tips happen online. Kind of tips happen in the forests from people who are really knowledgeable versus people who aren't that knowledgeable, but they think they're very knowledgeable. And ultimately, I think that's just really what you find when you go to any kind of scene, whether it's fishing or it's sport, chess, any kind of field, anything at all, tiddlywinks, there's always going to be drama and people politics, and mushrooming is no different.
Yeah, it's a good point. And it's funny because after our last chat, when you were talking about this, and it kind of piqued my interest, I mentioned it to some mushroom hunters here. And they said themselves, like, yeah, sure, that happens here too. Yeah, it's not unique at all
Yeah,
to South Africa and the Western Cape. It's just the reality of, I guess, human nature. People have their thing, and they don't want it to change, and they want to protect it. So
that's
it's
it.
it's a difficult
Yeah,
thing, isn't it? It's a difficult thing.
you hit you hit the nail on the head. Yeah.
So you mentioned before about species becoming mycorrhizal that are actually not native species of mushroom. But I wanted to ask you about this because I think you said this to me before, and correct me if I'm wrong. But
Mm.
you've kind of recently been involved in the discovery of morels becoming mycorrhizal with a native species of, I don't know what you would call a protea. It is a tree or a bush? Forgive my ignorance.
That's okay. I think they're both. Not being a botanist, but I think they're classified as both. Maybe a
Okay.
shrub is a good way to put it. Maybe a shrub, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Which is also this like the national, I believe, is it not the national flower of South Africa? Like
Yeah, yeah. I mean, even our national cricket team is called the Proteas, and this
yes.
Protea from the Proteaceae family. This is the kind of mycorrhizal host we've recently discovered, which is super exciting. So to fill you in on what's been going on there, um, they're two incredibly knowledgeable younger foragers from the town of Stellenbosch here in the Western Cape. There's a guy who's a friend of mine named Brayton, and there's a girl named Elise, and they were students of University of Stellenbosch. They caught on to, I guess, my adventures of morel mushrooms. I was one of the first to kind of broadcast them to the world and the local food scene. And I got Joe Masarek, that Eastern European herbalist who lived on Table Mountain. He
Yes.
wrote about, he referred to morel mushrooms growing actually in my hometown where I grew up, and I didn't know about this before. So it took me a long time to really put pieces together to understand where these mushrooms grow. Fortunately, back in those days, there was a tool called iSpot, which is now commonly known, I guess, iNaturalist, a very similar kind of tool,
Yes.
where you can tag your finds on a map. And after a very long time of having all the theory behind where morel mushrooms grow, um, finally someone tagged it on the map. And I went to the spot, and there they were, morels for the first time in 2015. It was so incredible to see them. But I shared it to my Instagram, shared it to my Facebook at the time. I had over 30 friend requests overnight from local chefs, all wanted to know where they can get morels from. So it was like a huge deal that like people didn't really, I guess it was forgotten. You could say that morels grew in Cape Town. From our grandparents' generation, they kind of knew morels grew around here, but it was largely forgotten. And I was like the person who kind of brought them back into, I guess, the public's eye. Um, but with all of that came interest from other foragers like, oh, morels, like, you can't just pick porcini here. There's actually morels here too.
Yeah,
And with
yeah.
that spin-off, younger people started finding out more, including really gifted university students, my friends Brayton and Elise. And Brayton proposed that we actually study how these mushrooms grow because they seem to be associated with a certain kind of protea, shrub, tree, bush, one of the three we spoke about earlier. Um, and actually, we went out during season a few years ago and we took root samples or rootstock samples. We got a permit to actually dig around and where these mushrooms grow. And yes, under a microscope, there was a strong connection between fungus and plant connected at the root, which was so wild to see because it's our first reported case of a choice edible mushroom species growing in a mycorrhizal fashion with a plant native to South Africa. Now, to be clear, we have lots of mycorrhizal fungi in these fynbos habitats, but none of them were choice edible morel mushrooms. So this is why this is so huge. Currently, we've worked on a paper that's currently under review with I believe it's the Canadian Institute of Biology. They're kind of looking through that paper, but we have a lot of information about how they grow, how an original community here in Cape Town used to know about them. So I'm going to go off on a slight tangent about the story now, but
Yeah, please do.
what we've actually cool. What we've actually done in this paper is really pay homage to one of the original communities from 100+ years ago of people who knew about these mushrooms growing. So, as you know, South Africa has a very hectic and checkered past about apartheid. Apartheid in South Africa, it really ripped communities apart and did a lot of damage to the people in this country.
Mm.
But ultimately, one of the communities that was not too far from where I grew up on the Cape Peninsula, they lived in a certain area for at least 250 years, this community, like a village, rather, a rural village.
Yeah.
And they actually were picking morel mushrooms. They knew about it from their ancestors. We don't actually know how far it goes back. But in my research over the years, I've actually interviewed a few residents of this original village who were moved from the apartheid government to another area. And they're called as forced removals. District 6 is the most famous suburb of Cape Town that was torn apart through forced removals. This one I'm referring to is called Red Hill. And the people of Red Hill knew all about morel mushrooms. They called the mushrooms papalelas kos, which is a word that I'm unable to find the source of. What even language it is, I don't know. But ultimately, we've done a lot of kind of socio anthropological work to make sure that the voices are heard of these people who knew about the mushrooms first before any white person did here in Cape Town. So that's been a big focus of ours, is telling the stories as they were and respecting the people who were originally collecting these morel mushrooms growing with protea trees.
Oh, that's a remarkable story. And wow, yeah, I mean, it must be, I would love to have heard those conversations you had as well. I mean, it must be incredible hearing the history.
Yeah, it was so interesting, like chatting to, I mean, these guys now in their 70s, they're getting on in their years, but telling me, like their stories about when they were little children going out with their grandparents to collect these mushrooms in the wild, and how their grandparents would read the land, how they would look for trees, exactly the kind of stuff that you and I have spoken about now, how they relayed this information onto me through
Mm.
their own, I guess, association from their grandparents and beyond their ancestors was so interesting, how to avoid snakes, how to, look for certain areas where the mushrooms will tend to grow and so on. It was so fascinating.
I- Yeah, it begs the question, and I'm sure you have far more knowledge about this yourself, but it's the mycorrhizal transition to using proteas as a host must have either happened a very, very long time ago, or could it even have been in existence beforehand anyway, like historically, or do you think that it is actually definitely a foreign mushroom that's come in?
It's such a good question, Robin. So, with the research in this paper, Brayton and Elise have done a lot of genealogical research into the DNA of these morel mushrooms. And it turns out that its closest relative is a morel that grows in Tasmania, which makes the theory of Gondwana land, when the continents were all together,
Wow.
it kind of drives home the theory that this was once upon a time a species growing with a certain plant. And
Yes.
as continental drift happened over time, habitats changed, environments changed, the trees became different, but the mushrooms also only slightly changed. And what we're left with now are two different continents with very closely genetically matching mushrooms growing with different mycorrhizal hosts. And this has taken, as you know, I mean, continental drift takes a very long time to happen. So, yeah. So we're looking at origins of I think Gondwana land is the correct term, when the continents were kind of more together and less scattered apart. It goes back to those days. So I think a lot more work needs to be undertaken to understand the link better between this morel and the Tasmanian morel and the Australian morel. And also, interestingly enough, the second closest relative, apart from the Tasmanian one, is one that grows in North America. Genetically, a very close match. So the Cape Town morel, the Tasmanian morel, and a North American morel that grows, I think, in the Midwest in the USA, a certain species, they're very,
Interesting.
very closely matched to each other. So weird, but so
So
cool.
curious.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I mean that's it's it's such an interesting thing. I mean, I have no idea how long ago that continental drift happened, but it's we're talking millions of years, right?
Correct. And something else I'll reference is there's this morale paper we've been working on. The three of us have been working on another paper as well with a different edible species of mushroom that's also brand new to science. So I'll tell you how this happened. In 2016, a forager friend of mine messaged me and said, "Hey, Justin, a friend of mine who lives in a small town about 2 hours outside of Cape Town has been collecting and eating these mushrooms for a few years now, but he doesn't know what they are, but he's been eating them and they grow in his area." So you might be familiar with the town of Hermanus. You might have visited the
Yeah.
town of
Yeah,
Hermanus when
yeah,
you're here in Cape
absolutely.
Town. So this friend of mine took me to the town of Hermanus one day. It was during autumn 2016. And we went to the spot, and there were these gigantic white mushrooms growing from the ground, often in rings, like ring-like formations.
Hmm.
And they had really long stems. So you could pick one out of the ground, and they had long stems that were kind of submerged underneath the ground, long, thin, tapering stems. And they were so interesting, but I'd never seen anything like it before. So I ate them that night. I collected a few. I trusted the words of my friend's friend who said he'd been eating them this whole time and he's fine. And I picked these mushrooms, I ate them. They were utterly delicious, very meaty, but I didn't know what they were, which is actually breaking a cardinal rule of mushroom hunting, and that's don't pick what you don't know. But
Yeah.
I did it, which is actually kind of dodgy, but here I am. And long story short, the three of us have now worked on a paper to ascertain this is actually a species of oyster mushroom. It's a very weird oyster mushroom that
Wow.
grows from the ground. It doesn't actually grow from, you can typically buy an oyster mushroom grow kit from a garden center that grows in like sawdust kind of substrates. This grows directly from the ground in sandy kind of soil, and they're large, meaty mushrooms. And it's a brand new species of oyster mushroom previously unknown to science. Its closest relative is another oyster that grows in Australia, which once again brings home that theory about continental drift has happened with what was originally one strain of species is now more, thanks to, I guess, localized evolution over time happening in these two different habitats here in Africa and there in Australia across the Indian Ocean.
That's so cool. Like giant oyster mushroom growing from the ground. I'd love to see that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
wild.
Amazing. I've got one little question here in this section about mushrooms in South Africa. And you've covered this quite a lot, but like if there's any kind of top line advice to tourists who are thinking of coming and mushroom hunting in, let's say, the Western Cape, what would you say is like the best way to go about it? Like the best way to just get started on the right foot?
Look up the name Justin Williams on Google. Shameless plug there. But I think, I think what my point is, like, find a guide, find a local expert who knows how to find mushrooms when they are to be found. Buy a local field guide. There's a very good local field guide called Field Guide to the Mushrooms of South Africa by two authors, Greisenhout and Goldman. It's a very good field guide. It's probably the most up-to-date resource that we have available at the moment. And between a field guide and a real kind of guide in person, I think you can't really
Yeah.
go wrong. I think those are the pieces of advice I would dispense. Don't just go into the woods and pick anything you find and expect it to be edible, like I did as a 10-year-old, because it could be really bad.
Or as a grown adult in Croatia.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Correct.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, awesome. Okay, well, thanks for that. That information is absolute gold dust. I'm sure people are going to find that, oh wow, very useful, and also, I mean, super interesting as well.
Yeah.
So, what I'd love to talk about now, if we still have time, thank you for sharing so much of your time already. You are writing your book at the moment, and there is a chapter in that about cooking the local species of mushrooms, if I'm correct. Correct me if
Yes.
I'm wrong at any point, of course.
It will do. No, that's spot on so far.
Okay, so I'd love if you wouldn't mind sharing some of those mushroom greatest hits that you went through now, if there are specific ways to prepare them, because I think you said that each mushroom has its own kind of vibe about
Mm.
that's
Yeah.
the best way in which to cook or approach cooking each one. Does that make sense?
That's right. Yeah. So I think every mushroom has to be looked at in isolation. When you have something like a porcini, it's a large, spongy mushroom that is very meaty, and it has these pores underneath its cap that not everybody enjoys the texture and flavor of. So when you handle a porcini, it's useful to know that the pores or sponge underneath its cap can be removed for a better eating experience. And then something like applying a dry saute to most mushrooms you find, I think is a useful cooking technique, because what it does is a dry saute enables the moisture that's naturally contained in the mushroom to be leaked out. And once that moisture has evaporated, adding a fat like butter or oil does really good things for the texture of a mushroom. It kind of reduces some of that squishiness aspect that a lot of people don't like mushrooms because of the squishiness or the squeakiness
Yes.
in your mouthfeel. Um, yeah, but a dry saute is a really good thing to do, as well as understanding a chemical reaction called the Maillard reaction. And that's really got to do with a toasted marshmallow, that brief caramelization of a toasted marshmallow or a toasted piece of bread. That browning can be applied to mushrooms. So, like if you take, for example, like portobello mushrooms and you put them flat down onto a pan after you've dry sauteed them and added your fat, if you take a weighted object like a plate or a brick covered in tinfoil, put it on top of them, it evenly distributes their kind of surface area for cooking. And
Yes.
one thing you really want to do is never overcrowd your pan with mushrooms. Like you want them to have space, and you want them to have the evenly applied amount of pressure to create this Maillard reaction from happening, which gives it this beautiful toasty. It enhances that like kind of umami flavor. And then towards the end of cooking your mushrooms in the pan, which I would say medium heat for a long period of time, as opposed to hot and fast, rather go low and slow for a very long period of time, because mushrooms in their cellular structures have a lot of chitin in them, which is actually quite difficult to cook and break down, especially in the human body. So what you really want to do is cook low and slow for a very long time. And towards the end of your cooking process, you can add something like soy sauce into your pan to really elevate that umami aspect. Or you can add something like a bit of sherry vinegar to have a bit of acidity in your mushrooms. And I personally like having a bit of acidity. Like I love vinegars in general. Adding a bit of vinegar in the pan afterwards just gives it this beautiful light kind of bite when it hits your mouth. It's so good.
It
Yeah.
sounds amazing.
I'm
The
literally
way you
salivating,
speak
dude.
about, yeah, me too. The way that you speak about it with such detail and it's fantastic. So if there was, I mean, you've covered like a lot of really great information there. If there was I mean, that you've kind of talked specifically about mushrooms and how to like handle the mushroom itself. But if there was a one or two kind of top recipes that you personally like best, would you mind sharing something like that, like within the context, or do you only eat the mushroom? The mushroom is pure and it must be consumed alone with nothing else other than fat. And this was it? Did you say the Maynard effect, or maybe I'm saying it wrong?
No, it's a really great point. So I think there are two schools of thought. The first school of thought is mushrooms should be the hero of the dish, and you should make a simple dish with mushrooms to let its bold, wild flavor stand out. So that's one school of thought, and there are many
Yeah.
ways to accomplish that with the mushroom being the hero of the dish. But a lot of chefs look at mushrooms to supplement a meat. For those who eat meat, I eat meat myself. I've drastically decreased my meat intake over the last couple of years. But when I do have meat now, red meat, I will use mushrooms to kind of elevate them. So even if I have something like duck, which is quite rare, I don't often eat duck. It's a great meat, but I will cook morel mushrooms with my duck because morel mushrooms are quite pricey and rare, and duck is great to eat. And I will pair these two together to really make the duck pop, bouncing off the morels kind of smokiness and sweet aspect. It really works well with the duck. My favorite dish, I have to be honest, is more on the side of a simple mushroom dish where it's one ingredient, and that's the porcini mushroom itself. And that's a carpaccio of porcini. It's something that's really cool to do when you find your first porcini of the season. I will find a very young one that hasn't really fully expanded in its cap yet.
Yeah.
The pores are still very much white and not haven't gone yellow
Yes.
yet. And what I
Yeah.
would do is I'll take a mandolin and watching my fingers, I would shave very thin slices using a mandolin and arrange them down on a plate. Add some lemon juice, some vinegar, a bit of salt and pepper and herbs, and I'll let that cure in that mixture, almost like a ceviche, for about
Yeah.
10 to 15 minutes. And then I will enjoy this beautiful, lightly cured porcini carpaccio, which is like this nutty, woody flavor, accentuated with the acidity of the vinegar and the lemon juice. It's so good. And that for me has become a ritual once a year. First porcini of the season, I'll have a carpaccio that night.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a great tradition to start as well. I think I might have to start doing that as well.
You must. You
Amazing.
must. Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm assuming the chapter in your book that's coming is recipes and suggestions like this that you've mentioned now. But I'm wondering, are there any other chapters in the book that you want to kind of give an overview of or tease us with about what kind of stuff you're going to be talking about,
Yeah.
or is it you're going to
Each
keep it under wraps for a while?
I think I'll strike a balance between the two, not lead on too much, but also tease enough for you to want to get a copy of the book when it's out. So every chapter, most of the chapters in the book have been dedicated to one of the choice edible species you can find growing in South Africa. And when I say choice edible, I mean, a mushroom, if it's a choice edible, it means that it's utterly delicious. It has a high culinary appeal. It can probably be found on the plates of Michelin-starred restaurants. And these are mushrooms that you do find in South Africa, like porcini you find, morels you find. These are choice edibles. So each chapter in the book is dedicated to one of those choice edibles. And there are around 20 to 30 in South Africa. It really depends on your own, I guess, palate, how much you view it as a choice edible. I reference porcini. Not everyone likes porcini and truffles. Not everyone likes truffles, but a lot of people do. So it's really up to you if you define it as a choice edible. In the book, I've really written down my thoughts on cookery, like we spoke now about dry sauteing and the Maillard reaction and applying even pressure to cook. I've kind of dropped a lot of nuggets into the mushroom cookery chapter. And then I think one of the coolest chapters I've written about is the termitomyces chapter or termite mushroom chapter. Now, these termite mushrooms, I early on referenced three contenders for the best and tastiest mushroom in the country. One of them was the termite mushroom or the Natal beefsteak. There's
Hmm.
a chapter I've written about where there are 5 of these species of termite mushroom that are all similar but different. And it was just so interesting for me to dive into the research that's been done between the relationship of termite and fungus, how we think one is farming the other, but we don't know which one is farming the other one. Um, I think there's a lot of cool stories for people to experience in the book about the relationship of insect and fungus. And I think, just sharing my own knowledge and experience over the past couple of years, um, when I did release the ebook version 4 years ago, so the book has been released as an ebook 4 years ago.
Oh, okay.
I've sold a couple hundred copies. It's gone quite well, but a publisher has picked it up, and it's a very slow process now to get it to print, but it's ongoing. And I think people have read the ebook, they loved it. I got a lot of good feedback and some constructive feedback, which is also good. I've taken all of that now, and I'm happy to bring to South Africa something unique that hasn't really been done before, and that's like a comprehensive guide to the choice edible species of South Africa. And the book will be called Mushroom Hunting in South Africa.
Mushroom hunting in South Africa.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's it.
amazing. Yeah, cannot wait. It's going to be good. Do you have an idea? You think it's going to be a year or two before it comes out when you've got it completely finished off, or do you know you have
No
an idea
timeline
of when?
yet. Work is
Okay.
ongoing. the editing
Yep.
process is quite strenuous because the editors with the publisher don't really know the scientific facts. They all are reliant on me to verify
Mm.
the information. So whenever I make a statement or a claim about a mushroom, I have to be absolutely sure that this is verified info. Because if we obviously publish unverified info, it won't be a good look for us. So everything has to be really gone through with a fine tooth comb, and that's what's taking time. I would optimistically say it should be on shelves within the next 2 years, but it could be more, it could be less. But I'm hoping for within 2 years it'll come out.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It's going to be great.
Thanks,
And
man.
one more question.
Hmm.
I think one more question. Yeah, it seems like that we're about at time.
Hmm.
So what I would say is, you mentioned before, or we were talked a little bit before about follow your nose as your new project that you're doing. How's it going? And I'd love to hear more about the whole reason behind it and your experience with that. And yeah, just the fragrance world. I mean, I don't know if your interactions with the fragrance world as a whole, if that's been a thing that's happened because of this project. I'd love to
Oh
hear about
man,
that too.
the fragrance world is so different to the mushroom world. They are like it's like worlds apart, man. I can't even begin to tell you like how different the knowledge is, how different the people are. The fragrance community are mostly well-dressed people who are quite affluent. They can afford expensive perfumes, but foragers are usually quite humble, nature-driven people who, don't always spend a lot of money on perfume. So I'm kind of straddling this weird sense of I'm kind of involved in a community of well-to-do people who spend a lot of money on fragrances. Not me. I don't have the money to spend on a lot of perfumes. I make them, but I can't. I'm not buying like signature, like branded fragrances.
Hmm,
And then spending time with mushroom people who are a lot more earthy in that sense. But fragrances are very mysterious. I think there's a lot of mystery around what goes into a bottle of perfume. And my quest has really been to understand how to make a good fragrance. I started off a few years ago mixing some essential oils together, wearing that. It wasn't smelling good at all. It didn't last well on my skin. And over time, I realized, okay, there are actually some aroma molecules that perfumers use to make a perfume project more, to
interesting.
stay longer on your skin. So there's a strong level of chemistry, which I've had to teach myself. Having never studied science or chemistry in high school, I've had to kind of go back to that level and kind of upskill to understand basic chemistry. And follow your nose, I think, is a coming together of these two worlds colliding: fragrance and perfumery, and fungi, foraging, and nature. And how I want to make my mark into the world is with my venture called Follow Your Nose. And really, what that is offering scent tours to people visiting Cape Town, taking them for a walk in the forest, showing them what cool native plants we have, how they smell, and then showing them the essential oil of that plant and being like, can you smell the difference? So there's a level of alchemy that comes to perfumery where you have your plant matter and then your essential oil that's derived from it, and then maybe an essential oil molecule that's derived from that, and then letting my guests smell the differences. They're blown away by that. And then something like an orange tree, right? An orange tree, if
Hmm,
you can imagine, an orange tree has leaves, which are aromatic. You can distill an essential oil from the leaves. It has beautiful flowers called neroli buds, which you can also get an oil from those, as well as the fruit, orange fruit themselves. You can get essential oils from those. Letting my guests smell three distinctly different smelling scents coming from the same tree blows their minds. They really love that. So I'm kind of taking that approach here and introducing people to feinbos plants that are aromatic and how they could be used in novel fragrances yet to be seen by the world. So I've been tinkering a lot after hours, building perfumes, adding my own touch from things that are foraged out in the wild, making extractions of their oils from these cool plants, and really developing my own signature style of perfume making.
So you sounds like you've already. I mean, I had a question in my mind. It sounds like you've already answered it, but you are planning to release a fragrance or maybe a line of fragrances at some point, like as your own
Yes.
thing.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah, working on it, it's a lot of work. I never really know when to stop. So when I've got something smelling good, but I'm like, yeah, like everybody's biggest critique is themselves. So
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, it doesn't smell good. I can add this, I can add that. And the thing with the fragrance is that it has to mature for about 3 months. So when I make a formula for a fragrance and I mix it all together, I actually have to let it rest. for 3 months for those molecules to actually bind together and actually find themselves. There's a huge difference between spraying something on my skin that I've just made versus smelling it 3 months later. So every time I'm making something, I have to wait a couple of months and then realize, okay, it's great, or no, it sucks, back to the drawing board. So it's kind of like an iterative process, I guess.
Oh man, I'm imagining that that must mean that you have to create quite a few batches then of like what you think is an area of fragrance, but because otherwise it's going to take you forever to keep going
Yeah,
back and just tweaking one thing at a time.
yeah, exactly. And it's quite expensive buying the materials as well. So that's taking a bit of time. A lot of the materials used in perfumery, like these molecules, are not available here. I have to get them from suppliers in Switzerland, North America, and there's shipping fees. So it does add up. But I'm kind of making waves slowly but surely, considering like my time constraints and budget and so on and so forth. I'm working my way through slowly but surely.
That's very cool, man.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm curious. You keep creating more and more questions in my mind.
Go ahead.
But have you ever, I mean, I'm sure you must have experimented with it, but have you ever tried using any mushrooms as an element of your fragrances? Does
I
that
have.
work?
It totally does. It's such a great point, Robin. So there are two very common mushrooms used in a lot of perfumes, and not many
Oh,
people
are
know
there?
this. The one is lichen. Lichen that grows on the rock or grows on
Yeah,
a log.
absolutely. Yep.
Lichen in perfumery is called oak moss. And there's a certain species of lichen, which is a fungus, I might add. It's a symbiotic relationship between a plant cell and a fungus. That's what makes a lichen that appears on a rock. Now,
Okay.
that's used, a large amount of lichen is gathered, and the CO2 carbon based extraction can be done. And ultimately, what you're left with, it's similar to how THC is extracted from the cannabis plant. The same kind of process is applied to lichen. And what you're left with is this beautiful, thick, viscous, dark brown liquid called oak moss, which smells very earthy, almost like a forest. That's used as a base note. And then the other famous fungus ingredient is called oud, O-U-D, oud.
Okay.
And
Oud.
oud is basically, so there's a certain type of tree that grows in the tropics of Eastern Asia, and a certain fungus will actually attack this tree parasitically, and the tree, in defense, exudes a certain kind of resin, and that resin kind of stains the inner heartwood of the tree. And then that inner heartwood that's been stained with its resin is then done through distillation using a copper still or a lembic copper still to actually derive an essential oil from this resin stained wood. And the resulting liquid is this incredibly woody, smoky, scented liquid called oud, thanks to a
Wow.
fungus. Yeah.
Thanks to a fungus.
Yeah. So
That's
crazy.
amazing. Well, thanks to the fungus and thanks to you, Justin. Thanks for your time today. I
Thank you,
mean,
Robin.
I've had an amazing time.
It's been so good chatting with you. Just really connecting with someone like mycelium does, forging new bonds, making new connections, exchanging information. This is, I think, one of the cool things about being a fan of fungi is like you often relate how fungus works to your connections with people. And today, what we've done is, I think, a very cool mycelium based kind of activity, just exchanging knowledge and nutrients with each other. It's been amazing, dude.
It's true. And fantastic analogy. I love it.
Yeah.
So, how can people follow you, reach you, maybe the publisher that if they want to find your book or where it will be available at some point in the
Mhm.
future, any of that information, follow your nose as well. What are maybe some links or websites that people can go
Yeah.
to? That'd be great.
So for those visiting South Africa, especially Cape Town, they can find Follow Your Nose going to followyournose.co.za. That's the website, so people can find me
Okay.
and book on. I am most active on Instagram. My handle is Fungi and Fragrance, where I share a lot of my foraging adventures and perfumery kind of adventures as well. And then the ebook, it's available at learningmushrooms.com is the domain that people can visit to download the ebook. The publisher is under wraps for now, but all shall be revealed in due course.
Okay.
But between followyournose.co.za and Instagram, Fungi and Fragrance, I'm definitely reachable between those two.
Amazing. And
Yeah.
hopefully at some point in the future, once that book is out there and available for people, you can jump. I'd love to have you back on the show and
Yeah.
we can talk more and you can promote it then.
I'd love that, Robin. That'll be so great.
Thanks again, Justin. And hopefully speak to you soon. I'll definitely give you a shout next time I'm coming over to South Africa. Maybe we could go do some foraging together.
Sounds so good, man. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been great to be here with you.
Right. That wraps up another episode. Thank you again to Justin for all the skills and wild stories. I'm sure that there's some South Africans out there now who can add a few extra tools to their mushroom toolbox. Definitely some people over there in the Western Cape who are no doubtedly inspired to get out to their areas that they can forage for mushrooms and see what they can dig up under the duff. Well, I should probably not say that because not necessarily encouraging anyone should be digging under the duff. Oh wow, I'm opening a controversial can of worms here. But moving onwards, I'm sure there's maybe even a few mushroom or mycology enthusiasts abroad who have now got South Africa on their radar as a place to potentially go. Again, thanks to everyone for listening and coming along on this journey. A quick like or subscribe is always helpful and definitely appreciated. The algorithms and myself will thank you immensely. And that's all for now. Well, actually, but first, I'm going to try a little thing I've been playing around with in my mind. Maybe like a little sign off. Let's see how it goes. If it feels wild, get out there and get after it. Yeah, I'm going to let that sit and see how it simmers in my brain. That's all for now. Until next time.